Okay, hi, welcome to my online mentorship group session for February 2018. Today we are going to be talking about my three-stage painting process. I think of it in terms of three steps. It's depending on the day, it can be more like 4.5 or 5 steps, but in general terms, I break it down into 3 stages of an Alla Prima painting. The first stage is the underpainting. The second stage is values, and the third stage is color application. And then in between, step 2 and step 3, we get color mixing, which really is a phase all of its own. But for simplicity's sake, I break it down into kind of a block in, firming up my values, and then applying color. So I have sent you all photos of my simple still life that I set up today, some orange slices. And I'm going to be talking to you all coming up this month, I think, about experimenting with using just a few simple objects in a still life, but how many different combinations and how many different compositions can you get if you just took 3 or 4 of the same object and a light source, so interesting cast shadows. And I've got that going on here today. I have 4 slices of orange, and I'm going to do a little simple demo to show the stages of my process. All right, so I have my still life set up on my left. This is important because I'm a right-handed painter. And I never want to put my painting arm in between my eyes and the thing that I'm painting. So if my still life is over here, down next to me on a low height, it's actually a box with a board on top of it, and the still life is set up on that. I will make sure that I orient my body so that my painting arm isn't between my eyes and my setup. I can look very easily and just turn my head from still life to canvas to palette. My palette's on the left. Let's look at my palette for just a minute. I have titanium white, cadmium yellow, Hansa yellow, yellow ochre. This is pyrrole red. That's one of the new M-gram colors. Alizarin crimson, dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. So it's pretty much a split primary palette with some bonus colors. We got 2 reds, 2 yellows, 2 blues. Ivory black is the cooler blue in this scenario, I guess. And the bonus colors are yellow ochre and dioxazine purple. Sometimes I'll use a tube of a brown, but less and less often lately. I've really been mixing my brown. And what I have right here is the color for my underpainting. It's the color that I always use for toning my canvas and doing the block in, which is the first step in the process. And I've mixed it from, well, really, any neutral that you're going to get is going to be a combination of red, yellow, and blue, right? But if it's an orange, it'll be heavier on the red and yellow. This is a combination of the pyrrole red, cadmium yellow, and a little bit of the ultramarine blue to make this neutral, mid-value orange. Burnt sienna is also a good option for this. And I'm going to take that and tone my canvas with it. So I use a pretty big brush. Where's my rag here? I use a pretty big brush to just wash the canvas with my underpainting color. This is a number 6 flat, and the canvas I'm working on today is 8x8. It's a Masterpiece brand canvas. That's my favorite brand right now. And the brush is by Connoisseur. It's white taklon, synthetic fiber. But I'm going to switch it up. I'm just going to give the canvas a thin wash of my underpainting color. I like working into a wet tone. A lot of people will do an opaque tone, right? They'll tone all their canvases, leave them out and let them dry for a while, and then they like to go back and work into that dry tone. The reason that I like to work on a wet tone, as you're going to see, is that I like to be able to push and pull on the drawing, on the block in a little bit more as I'm laying it in than I would be able to if the tone was dry when I started. And I can pull lights out of this and add in darks rather than just adding in darks as I'd be able to on a tone canvas that was dry, that was a mid-tone. And I don't use any white in my underpainting. I know you're thinking, well, if the tone was dry, you could just add white. But then I can't paint Alla Prima over an underpainting that has opaque white paint in it. So during this stage of the painting process, the first stage, the block in, I'm not using any opaque white. I'm using the white of the canvas to modulate the value at this point. This is the only point in my painting process where I use the white of the canvas to modulate the value. I don't want transparent paint in the later stage where I'm doing the actual quote unquote painting. I don't want any transparent passages. Well, if I do, I will use them. But for the most part, what I want is opaque color later, transparency now. So, let's see. Just take a real quick check through my viewfinder again. I took photos of this simple still life setup and I sent them to you. I'm not looking at those right now. I don't like to paint from photos, and I don't like to use photos as my viewfinder. I like to use my viewfinder as my viewfinder. And so I do that. And I also don't really like to draw with one eye closed while I'm looking through a square aperture. It gives me a headache after a while. So what I'll do is I'll use the viewfinder just to lay out landmarks. Where does this orange enter the composition? You know, and then if I'm going to do that background paper, where are the points around the square of the canvas where that comes and goes, right? I find the landmarks. If the cast shadow is going off the canvas over here, where is that happening? And what do the negative shapes look like? And then I'll put my viewfinder down once I've sort of marked off those spots around the edge of the canvas where things interact with the picture plane. And then I won't use the viewfinder anymore after that. Well, I'll pick it back up if I have to. But generally, I don't like to do the whole drawing while looking through the viewfinder. So I'll just get the basic layout with it. And so then what I want to do is block in the composition. I don't do a ton of measuring when I paint, but I do a lot of comparing. So it isn't like I'm doing the thing where I hold up my paintbrush, you know, with a locked elbow and I'm measuring, although that is helpful, especially with portraits. But I do a lot of comparing. I'll do a lot of looking at negative shapes, the way that angles and lines interact with each other. Zooming out from drawing, let's say, this piece of orange wedge by itself to squinting and looking at the piece of the orange wedge and its cast shadow as one big shape together. If I'm having trouble judging the angle of a line, I'll hold my paintbrush up along that angle of the line to try to get a better idea of what that's doing. And I'm always looking at negative shapes. This little light shape right here. There we go. That's key for me. And that means that I don't get to do a lot of editing as far as the layout of objects. We just talked about editing in landscapes, how you go out in a landscape and you can't just go move that bush around. You can't pick it up and put it somewhere else. But in your mind, you can move it around and you can use that lighting information and color information that you're observing in the world, even though you're moving that bush from one spot to another. But when I'm painting a still life, I can move it around. I have that luxury entirely available to me. And so if I decide that I just don't like the placement of something, I'm going to change it in my actual still life. Because if I don't, and I just say, all right, I'm going to invent, I'm going to move it in my mind from one side of the table to another. I cease being able to use things like this negative shape of light to help myself draw the other pieces. Does that make sense to everybody? Because it's pretty important for me as far as why I do not change things. Okay, maybe that's a little longer. I don't change things with my mind. And if I feel the need to, I just go ahead and change them in the world. Now, measuring is really important. When I'm trying to decide how long to make this piece of orange, I'm going to hold my paintbrush up, close one eye, and hold it up along this bottom edge of this particular wedge and look at where it hits on this one. It hits about here. So maybe I'm about right the way that I've got this coming down. And where does the top hit? Well, the top is actually higher. So maybe this is really lower, a bit lower. And you can see already what I mean when I say that I like to work on the wet tone because I can push and pull on the drawing. It's a lot like charcoal, a charcoal drawing in that way, because I can erase and I can add in. That's higher, and then that's higher, but this guy is not going to go off the top. Not. And this is my favorite part. Everyone has their favorite part of the painting process, right? Some of us love the finishing touches, that last mile of the race. And some of us love that non-committal middle part where you're just cruising along. And for me, I find the end very stressful because I've got something to lose at that point. You know, I feel like I've got, it's mine to screw up at that point, and I don't like that pressure. I like this stage where everything is possibility. And I also just enjoy this pushing and pulling process and the drawing. I love to draw. I love to draw with a paintbrush. Okay. So I'm kind of switching into the second stage already, so I better explain. Once I get my block in established, once I lay out the position of the objects for my painting, the next step is to come in and start pulling out lights and putting in darks. And I just do that with the same brush. I've switched over from that number 6 flat that I toned the canvas with, and now I'm using a number 2 round, same brand, Connoisseur, same bristles, white taklon synthetic, number 2 round. This is my favorite brush that exists. I would paint all my paintings exclusively with this brush if I let myself, but I don't, because I get a looser, more rich and just nice effect from using the flats, and larger brushes. I think we should always aim, when we want to bring more looseness to our paintings, more abstract looseness to our brushwork, we should shoot for using the largest brush that we feel comfortable with for the size of the canvas, and maybe pushing that a little bit, maybe a little bit larger for the size of the canvas. But for a block in, I love this number 2 round. This is my drawing brush. So the next step for me is to come in and start pulling out some lights. So the first thing I need to do is stop and ask myself, where are my lightest lights? I'm still working on the drawing. But now I'm going to shift over to working on the drawing from the standpoint of seeing big value shapes. So if I switch the brush around in my Gamsol and then I wipe it on a rag, I've got rag in the left hand, brush in the right hand, Gamsol on the table, A clean brush that's been dried off just a little bit is like a magic eraser on this kind of surface. I can pull that nice wet paint right up and apply it somewhere else. And I start pulling out my lights and adding in my darks. Why is this important? Well, it's the next stage in the drawing process, but why is it important to have a tonal underpainting at all? Couldn't I just do a contour line drawing and then mix up my colors and launch in? You could. Why do I like to have a tonal underpainting? Well, so if I don't do a preparatory black and white study, or at least a thumbnail sketch, this is the part that helps me decide whether I've got a good composition going when the composition is based on big value shapes, and it always is. So especially if I've bypassed those preliminary studies, the black and white study, the thumbnail sketch, this stage shows me my big value shapes and how they're interacting to create that composition. But more importantly, having a tonal underpainting gives me a foundation. It gives me a foundational structure for my finished painting. I've got light canvas under the lights in the painting. I've got dark canvas under the darks. So it's really fundamentally my base layer of my painting. It's the underpinnings of, what is to come. And those lighter passages of canvas really do make, I think anyway, and that's the idea, having those lighter passages where I've pulled out the paint from underneath, having that under my lights in the finished color end product really does make those light parts more luminous. That's the idea. And many of you have heard me say this, even those of you who have just been watching my videos have heard me say this, that the longer I'm painting, the more time I spend on this part of the process, the underpainting. Really getting the underpainting just right, really making sure, those of you out there know who you are that I'm talking to, really making sure that I'm happy with my drawing and my composition and my layout before I launch into color. Not just saying, oh, it's good enough. I'm going to make those decisions when I get to them in color, as far as how I'm going to handle this area up here. For example, is this area up here going to be lighter or darker than the foreground? Well, no, I'm not going to make that decision when I come to it later. Something will happen, but it will probably be a default, or it'll be an accident, or it'll just be whatever it is, but it won't be a conscious decision. If I think about it, if I say I'm going to think about it then when I get to it, I won't, because I'll be caught up in the color application phase. I'll have 8 balls in the air, form, edges, mixing, all of that. And I won't think about it. I won't make that decision later. I make the decisions now. And so I spend more time, the longer I'm painting, in this underpainting stage, and also doing my preliminary black and white sketches, studies, whatever, making those decisions so that when I'm quote unquote painting in color, I can just paint, not just color in. That's not what I mean, but I mean just give myself over to the color seeing, the color mixing, the color application, the brushwork, those aspects, and fully be present with those aspects, because I've already decided where my lightest lights and darkest darks are going to be. I've already done that work. Okay, so as you see me darkening just a bit, what I'm doing is the paint is getting thicker. I'm building up layers of paint to darken, but I'm trying not to get too goopy with the paint. I don't want really thick paint that isn't going to set up quickly, because this is Alla Prima, wet into wet, all at once painting. I'm not going to wait for this to dry. I'm going to paint right over it. I want that to be very implied. So you're probably thinking like, well, this is oil paint. It isn't going to dry. How are you going to just work on it? Well, it isn't going to dry, but this thin paint that's really just diluted with Gamsol is going to sink into the canvas. Raw white canvas primed with gesso is perfectly situated to absorb thin paint. It wants to kind of suck it up. And what I do is I get this underpainting established, and then I let it sit and get sucked up by the canvas while I do some color mixing. Step 2.5. Right now I'm in the second step, which is values, firming up my values, putting in my darks, pulling out my lights. Right now I'm just pulling out lights. But do you see how the painting is starting to emerge? So if I'm not getting enough lights out with my brush, and I'm not really, you can come in with a rag. I love these blue shop towels. They don't shred up and get little pieces of fiber in the canvas the way that your normal kitchen paper towels do, so I recommend them. You can dip a little corner of the paper towel in Gamsol. It's a wonderful painting tool in and of itself. Start pulling out those lights. Look at how the negative shape defines the form. You know, it's this combination of light shapes and dark shapes on this canvas that is making this painting happen in your eye. It isn't the fact that it's oranges. It isn't the way I drew the oranges. It's the layout of light and dark shapes. That is what you're going to see from across the gallery and go, oh, I want to go over there and look at that painting. That's what we're doing. Where's my lightest light? The lightest light and darkest dark. And before you move on from the underpainting, there are some questions to ask yourself. And one of them is, where's my focal point? Is it also my area of strongest value contrast? Where is my strongest value contrast? So in this painting, what is my focal point? I'm pretty sure that the focal point is going to be this guy right here, this area. We talk about the rule of thirds. We've talked about it before, and we'll talk about it again. We're going to talk about it every month until the end of time, ladies. The rule of thirds, the basic idea of composition. You divide your canvas up into thirds vertically and horizontally. There was a line here and a line here, and then thirds, line here and a line here. The intersecting points of the lines are called the sweet spots. Those are good places in the painting to put focal points. They don't lead the eye out, they're inside the painting. So this isn't a good spot for a focal point, but it isn't just that. It's because this is where my area of strongest value contrast is going to be. My darkest darks next to my lightest lights, because I see my lightest light in the painting being this highlight on the orange here, but also this piece on the ground, this blue. This is where the strongest light is hitting. There's strong light over here, but it isn't so much strong contrast because this part is light. This is the shadow side of the orange, these two cast shadows. And so the next step in this process of putting in lights and pulling out lights and putting in darks is to put in a few darks. So I come to my palette with this warm neutral orange that I've mixed up, and I start pulling in a little bit of alizarin crimson and maybe a little bit of the ultramarine blue into that orange. The paint, as you saw, is very thin still. There's a fair amount of Gamsol in it. I'm not thinning the paint with oil or mediums at this point, just Gamsol, just the paint thinner, the solvent. It's the fat over lean principle. Fat over lean in oil painting means paint that has more oil in it, or paint that is just thicker goes over paint that is thinner, more transparent. That's mainly, well, there are two reasons for that. Adhesion, getting paint to stick to paint, and drying time. Thicker paint, fatter paint, paint with more oil added to it dries slower. And you want slower drying paint over faster drying paint in the layers. Okay, so I'm adding in my darks. Where are my darkest darks? This cast shadow. And here's the thing about rinds, peels, when we're talking about citrus. We've all got this idea, this old idea, this kind of core concept that rinds and all cut faces of citrus are very light. But they really are not. And even the white part of the rind here, if I squint at it, it's almost the same value as the cast shadow. And the white part of the rind is actually darker than this outer part on this side. So, you know, paint what you see, not what you know. That's what that means. We don't know much when it comes to the visual world. We don't remember much. We just keep relying on perception as we go about our day. It serves us well as survivors, as humans living. Doesn't serve us so well as painters painting. We need to have beginner's mind when we're looking at the world. So that we can come with fresh eyes and see like artists. I read something this week that I loved. I don't know where, forgot where, but the person was talking about seeing like a painter, and she used the phrase, purposefully act to see, which I thought was like a little poem. Okay, so adding in darks. I'm still drawing. I'm drawing pretty much at every phase of the painting, which means that I'm making comparisons. I'm looking at shapes, positive and negative. And clean the brush off, and I can continue to pull out lights. It's like a magic erase board. Let's erase those little lines I made for the rule of thirds. It's really easy. Everything is fluid. Depending, if you're outside and you're doing this, this is going to dry on you fast. You might even start to think, wait, did I bring my acrylics today? Because, you know, this paint will, the Gamsol will evaporate. The paint will sink in faster if you're outdoors, if the weather is warm, or if the air conditioning is turned up really high. So anytime it's dry, temperature conditions will affect this and make the underpainting setup faster. Not necessarily a bad thing, but you won't be able to pull out lights forever. That's why I like to pull some of them out first and then add in the darks. And it's not like it's, you know, drying up before my very eyes or anything. There's that line, and this comes a little closer. I don't know what the deal is here with this drawing part. Maybe that's flatter. But the longer I'm painting, the more time I spend on this phase. I love doing the underpainting. I love playing around with it. But the more time I spend here, very often, the more successful my finished painting becomes. And really, the faster, the less time I have to spend on the rest. Okay, so that's it. That's the first two stages, the block in and the light and dark values. Now I'm going to do the next. So now we want to move on to adding color, but first we have to do some mixing. I'm a big fan of pre-mixing my paint. Not my brush goes into everything, and as I'm working and as I'm painting, I generally, every time the brush goes back to the palette, I change what's on it a little bit. I'll grab something a little bit different, I'll change it up, but I do like to pre-mix to make sure that I've got the fundamental building blocks of the color scheme of my painting. And that means I mix up something for the light parts and the shadow parts of all of the main things in my painting. So it's orange. I don't have a tube orange. I'm not a big fan of tube orange. I don't know. I'm a big fan of tube purple, so it's not like I don't like the secondaries in a tube. Orange has not been one that I've found has been helpful to me. It's so powerful, cadmium orange. I like what happens when I mix the orange. So I want something real saturated. The thing is, you get, with these oranges, you get more saturation on the shadow side, generally. And lucky me, I've already got this kind of like dull, mid-tone, neutral orange mixed up from my underpainting. I can use that to darken things a bit if I need to. Think about using your alizarin crimson rather than your warm red. The alizarin crimson has blue baked in. I need something for a light orange. So I'm going to use both my yellows, probably mostly alizarin crimson with both the yellows. Maybe a little yellow ochre. It's so greenish. It really dulls it. And then you can compare right on the palette as you're mixing. How much lighter is that? What's the value difference there? You know, it's a little lighter. And I don't have that much value difference between the light side and the shadow side of my orange slices. It's very subtle. If I squint, I definitely see it, but it's pretty subtle. So I think that that's good. And the rinds, of course, are pretty dark. I'm just going to go right into this underpainting color, add some more red to it. That was way too much red. This Pyrrole red is a beastly bully. I really like it, but it's stronger than I expect. And then we need something for those rinds, the white parts. They're white. Those of you who have been studying with me for a while, red finger, those of you who have been studying with me for a while know that I like to approach anything that's white by starting from a flesh tone. I just do. It's that pretty much whenever you want to mix anything white, it's a gray. And when you want to mix a gray, you pick a complementary color pair and mix up a neutral from it and then add white to it. My preferred start point is blue-orange, right? And so that's a flesh tone. What is a flesh tone but a neutralized orange with white in it? So I start from kind of a fleshy tone place, and that's pretty much red plus yellow plus white. And then I'll neutralize it with blue until I get it to start feeling like the quote unquote white that I want. And this white is kind of a yellowish, really. I'm looking at the whites around the edge of the rind. They're yellowish. I can always add more white later if it's not light enough. And then on the shadow sides, I see them being almost green. They could be, I do see them as being kind of green in spots. So I'm going to take some of this, some of my tone color, and I'm going to take some purple. Purple and yellow together they're complements, they'll neutralize each other, but they make a greenish neutral. I know this because I've done my color charts. I kind of like that. The truth is, you can get away with a lot color-wise, as long as you match the value. That may not be dark enough. Let's pull in some yellow ochre too. Purple, yellow. A little warmer. Add some alizarin crimson. As I was saying, you can get away with a lot color-wise as long as you match the value. Color gets all the credit, but value does all the work as far as creating form in a painting. So give yourself a break if you're having trouble mixing a color, or if you can't figure out what color something is. Just match the value and take a guess at the color. I can just see all the YouTube comments jumping all over me for saying that, but I said it. Deal with it. All right. No, we need a couple more things. And you know, this is just a starting point, right? Something for the light parts of the orange, something for the darker parts of the orange, something for the rinds. I can already tell that's going to be too saturated. Let's add some purple to it. A little purple, a little white, maybe a little blue. That's probably too much. One thing I want to point out is that I'm mixing the paint with the front of the palette knife. This is the back of the palette knife. This is the front of the palette knife. I'm mixing between the front of the palette knife and the surface of the palette. So I'm pushing. I'm not doing this. I'm pushing the paint. I flip it over and I push it. It's like the scooper part of the spatula. I'm pushing it against the palette with that. Okay, I don't know. It's way too dark. Lighten with yellow. Always try to lighten with yellow. Especially when we're talking about warm colors. White will blue it down. Yeah, you might want that. You might not. Or maybe just a little bit, but you can always add more white later. White and color mixing is like salt in cooking. It's real easy to add more at the end, but it's pretty hard to get it out once you've overdone it. Okay. Good. And I want something for the negative space, that blue. Maybe a little ultramarine. I think I'm going to use mostly ivory black to make that blue. I use black on my palette almost all the time, and I do not think of it as black, and I do not paint black things with it. I think of it as a blue. So my ivory black is a dull, dark, neutral blue. So I use it to darken other blues. I use it to mix greens. I use it to neutralize oranges. I use it to make violets. Ivory black makes beautiful violets with alizarin crimson, by the way. But I do not use it to paint black things. Okay, my finger keeps going in the red. Means it must mean I've got a larger scoop than I'm used to. It's just my day to have a red middle finger. And I want a couple different things for the blue too, and I need something for the cast shadow. Okay, no, let's start with ivory black, and then I'm going to put some of that pyrrole red in it. So we'll make a violet with the ivory black and the pyrrole red, and then we'll lighten it and see what happens. Look how beautiful. Black and red. Beautiful violet. Way too warm. It's too light. I mean, dark. Too dark. So it's really important to have something mixed up for the negative space and just something for a cast shadow. I can change the color. I can change the color temperature of the cast shadow, but getting the right value relationship is key. And I can look at it together on my palette. I like to mix them near each other. Here's the cast shadow and here's the light part. That's way dark. That's way purple. If I want it to be less purple, I'll put some yellow in it. I'll put some yellow ochre in it, maybe. Okay, good starting point. So I'm gonna try to wipe the red off my finger a little bit before it gets all over my face, my body. And I'm gonna switch over to a brush. I'm gonna switch over to my number 4 flat. I'm gonna paint this with a number 4 flat. This has been my favorite recently. Princeton Summit Series, number 4 flat, also synthetic. Green handle. And where do I want to start? A lot of artists, especially portrait painters, like to start with the darks, the shadows. That's pretty helpful when you're painting a portrait. I've already shown myself the value of my darkest darks in the underpainting, so I don't have to start with the darks in order to establish that value hierarchy. Because really we want to get everything relative and we want to capture the relationships. So if I hadn't done this underpainting, it would be a good idea to jump in and show myself my darkest darks right off the bat. And I could do that. But I think what I want to do is start with my most vulnerable colors, which are going to be my cleanest, brightest, and most saturated colors. Or you can just go for an easy win, you know, something that you definitely know what to do with. Start there and then judge everything against that. That's always good when you really know what something should be. But the reason that I say start with the saturated colors is while the canvas is clean, while your paintbrush is clean, while your Gamsol is clean, like if you're painting a lemon, start with that bright saturated yellow. If you're painting a daffodil, start with the brightest, cleanest, lightest yellow and get that on there before everything else gets dirty. It really increases your chances of keeping it clean. Okay, so I'm going to come in with this saturated, nice mid-tone orange that I mixed up, which is basically for the darker sides of my oranges. And I can compare it already to the cast shadow value a bit because I have the cast shadow blocked in. And if I want it to be a little darker, I have some of that mixed up too. I can just pull my brush in to some of it that's a little darker. And I don't think of this, you could think of this as a color block in. I don't. I think of it as painting from the general to the specific, meaning that I don't want to get in and start painting the little orange segments right off the bat, but I just want to be squinting and getting the big shapes of color and value. And then I can get more and more specific with it as I go along. I paint a lot of whole oranges, but I don't cut them up that much. So this is a nice treat. All right. Notice how I'm doing a little bit of work and then I'm moving around. I'm letting the whole painting come up together. I don't finish one area before moving on to another area, almost never. So the next step is I'm gonna come over here to this orange and I'm really gonna squint. This is the piece that I have that's got the clearest distinction between light side and shadow side. And I really wanna show that. Now I'm not being that precious about my underpainting lines. I wanna make sure that I paint over and across my underpainting lines. I want to obliterate those if I can. I don't wanna save them for anything. Okay. And when you're doing that mixing, that color mixing step, make sure you make enough paint. I already didn't. What's wrong with me? It's so sad. Do you need more paint? Because it means that you got to put the paintbrush down and pick the palette knife back up. And that's hard to make ourselves do. Time spent mixing is time spent painting. But once we've already got the brush in the hand, it can be difficult to put it down and pick that palette knife back up. But believe me, it's the difference between a successful painting and a failed painting most of the time, because what happens is when we run out of that thing that we needed and we aren't willing to go back and mix more, what do? We grab the next closest thing. And it isn't right. I know that you guys do that because that's what I do. And it does not serve. Okay. Shadow side isn't really red. That shadow side, that far shadow side. More greenish. That's why I love having yellow ochre around. It's so greenish. I didn't used to understand that yellow ochre was actually a green, but I do now. Well, I'm definitely not going to be finishing this painting, but I want to try to give you the basic ideas. And you've already seen the 3 stages and how I conceptualize that. Just in the time that I spent mixing the colors, just in those few minutes, the underpainting really set up. I can come in here and rub right on, the darker passages of my underpainting, and yeah, I'll get some paint on my finger, but I'm not really going to mess this up too much. It's sunk in enough that I can paint this color right over it without much trouble at all. Okay, I'm coming into the rinds now, the light parts of the rinds. Notice in your mind where they are warmer and cooler. Maybe they'll be a little more yellowish in some areas and a little bit less yellow in others. The more white you add, the bluer it's gonna feel. And in between trips back to the palette, I'm wiping my paintbrush on the rag in my left hand. I haven't really been cleaning it in the Gamsol. You can always tell when I clean it in the Gamsol because it's very loud. Right? You hear it. Me rattling around in my jar. But if I'm just staying in the light values, or if I'm just staying in the rind, I will pretty much just wipe the brush, but not necessarily clean it out exhaustively. Mm. Notice how some parts of this rind are more yellowish. And then as they come up and they get more light, they change just a bit. So they aren't just the same one long stroke across. And I don't want to go over and paint over too many times I really want to get it down there and leave it alone as I keep going over this, because it'll get smushed into itself and you'll lose that variety. Can you kind of see how the rind goes from more yellow to a little more white as it goes around? And over here, the same way, it's a little more yellow in the middle, and then it gets a little cooler as it comes up around toward the edges. And it's still, it's messy, you know, but this is painting from the general to the specific. You're blocking in your big areas, and some of these will get to stay like this. And some areas, particularly around the focal point, will get more refined, maybe much more refined. That's up to you. Okay. And some of that refining is done by filling in what's around it. So when I want to really firm up that orange rind, I can do that by painting the negative, painting its negative space, which is this rind that's behind it. Really dark stuff. Is this thing right that I made? Is this? No, it's not. It isn't. So half the battle is when something is wrong, don't just say, oh, well, and spread it around all over the place. Go back to the palette and do something different. It's okay. It can be tough to mix and nail it the first time. It can be tough to mix and nail it the second time. The process of trial and error. And yeah, so even though I just got done saying color gets all the credit, but value does all the work. So don't worry about what color it is. If you can't figure it out, just do something. What I mean is I didn't have the value right. Something's got to be working. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what's next? Oh, the shadow side of the rind. Remember how I was talking about mixing up those kind of greenish neutrals? Is that too light? Probably is. Yeah, probably is. Let's go to the darker version. It's better. Maybe too green, maybe not. Yeah. If it's too green, we simply add some of the complement. And I have some nice reds and oranges already mixed up from painting the orange stuff. I can just pop right in there. Squint and notice either that those rinds are darker than the orange part that's next to them or not, and how they compare to the cast shadow too. It's a constant process of comparison when we're talking about values. It's really orange in there, this part. Good, I like that. Some of this underpainting is going to be your friend. We don't need to cover it all up, certainly. But just be careful of leaving the lines, because when it feels like you painted up to the line on one side, no, it's like, and then you painted up to the line on the other side and just stopped, kind of leaving that halo. I call it haloing, and it feels very tentative and not very satisfying. Try to avoid that if you can. The leaving the underpainting showing in some areas is great when it's a strategy. You know, so many things in life are great when we do them on purpose and not great when we do them by accident. And that is my deep thoughts with Sarah Sedwick for the day. Well, I'm going to wrap this up here.
True.
All right. Well, I will work on this more and I will post where I get. But this is how I start, and this is pretty much how I start every painting. You know, start with the parts that you can figure out the most easily, and then let everything else fall in line in a hierarchy. Relative. Everything's relative. But that's it. That's the 3 stages of the Alla Prima painting process.
Okay. Alrighty. I feel inspired.
Good. Well, I hope you're all feeling inspired. And it's been great to hang out with you this morning. Thank you for joining me.